The joyful spree of indulgence came crashing to a halt as the island's bounty shriveled into sickly nothingness. Panic swelled as most of the food in the kitchen had suddenly, inexplicably spoiled. To make matters worse, the crops in the fields and gardens had withered. Perhaps most painfully, the animals began to drop dead, whether from starvation or some unknown disease. Any food left untouched by this curse was strictly reserved for the Duke, his family, and their guests. In their new, dire circumstances, the Duke was forced to make an executive decision. Simply not everyone could be fed. Of course, being no fool, he realized that he had to keep this to himself. Instead, half of the servants were forced off the island. The Duke offered a half-hearted justification of food theft and inappropriate fraternizing with the guests. When questioned about any specifics, he offered no further detail. Then he ordered his guards to close the gates and bolt the doors. For this, he needed his strongest men to fight off the howls of desperation and mounting rage. And so, in the grand palatial resort, the party carried on. The servants, kitchen workers, and maids were to be seen and not heard. Yet, amongst each other, they brutally fought for whatever crumbs and slop left, oh so generously, behind on the tables. During the night, when the noise of the festivity went quiet for a time, the guests lay slumped in a drunken stupor. But there would be no peace and no silence, for in the distance he could hear the moans of gnawing hunger of those left behind outside. The Duke hated nothing more than that sound. He couldn't bear it. One evening, during a grand banquet, he simply thought he had heard its faint echoes outside of a window, and so he slammed his fists on the table. Everyone jolted up, looking around in bewilderment. Instead of screaming, he demanded that they laugh and tell him whatever jokes and amusing stories they could think of. In a frenzy, he called for the musicians to keep playing louder and louder until the volume drowned out the accursed noise from outside. But the Duke failed to account for one thing. You see, hunger is a great motivator for violence, and not even the wails of violins could drown out the cacophony of clashing metal and ravenous shrieks as the front gates were breached. The poor and desperate dropped dead, one by one, as security fired upon the mob. The Duke looked away, urging his jesters to laugh harder and play louder. The banquet hall doors came crashing down, ripped from their hinges with the ease of ripping paper. From every angle, the Duke was confronted with those who had been pushed well past their breaking point. feral rage glowed in their eyes. Their frothy mouths salivated for any morsel of that which had been hoarded from them. If all had been gorged by those who had banished them, then perhaps a taste of flesh would do. Among the mob, he spotted the bull, its chest puffed out in a fierce display of confidence, and its arms spread apart in the gleeful embrace of the enveloping chaos. It was as though all of this was the creature's plan, its work of art. Like a conductor, it waved its arms as if directing the feeding frenzy. The soft parts were the easiest to pluck and swallow. The eyes and tongues were gouged first, then the guts, which opened like a steaming minced pie with a hard stab from a fork. The organs were savored the most. The Duke stared in utter mortification before he managed to escape by the skin of his teeth. Along with the Duchess and a few lucky survivors, they managed to leave undetected. Guarded by his most loyal footmen, they were led up to a secured room in the upper level. They bolted the door shut with armed guards posted outside, ready to shoot on first sight. He counted the survivors one by one. As he reached the end, his heart sank into a bottomless pit. One life, that which mattered the most, was not among the survivors. "Our prince!" the Duchess cried in despair. Their firstborn and only son was gone. A horrible thought flashed across his mind. Somewhere out there, what remained of the prince was in some wretch's stomach. But a thin ray of hope came by word of mouth. The prince was alive. They had not devoured him. The Duke scanned the screens, switching on every camera and sending out drones to hover areas that the cameras couldn't reach. And just before one of his drones was shot down, he caught a glimpse of the prince among the bloodied shadows as they poured through the corridors, flowing up the stairs and sniffing out noble blood. With their guns and armored vests and helmets, the guards ventured on as if entering a war zone. But despite their training and their wealth of bullets, nothing could stop the bloodthirsty horde. The blackest despair hung heavily in the air as the Duke and his company were forced to listen to the final, agonizing shrieks of the last thing that stood between them and their own death. All they could do was pray, and they fiercely protected what little food and wine they had managed to save.
"The door is steel-framed and reinforced with carbon fiber,"
the Duke said.
"Not even a firing squad with semi-automatics could make a dent in it. We're safe. We're safe."
He repeated the last two words over and over. But as his frightened wife and surviving guests stared at him in disturbed confusion, those words only seemed to comfort himself. They reverberated throughout the room, tormenting his guests with their hollow promise of survival. The Duke's mantra was broken by a guttural roar like no other animal. It ripped through the air and charged towards the door. Fate stood on the other end of that door. He knew it, and a chill descended upon his bones. Once more, the entity howled in rage before charging their last recourse from the unfolding massacre. The bolts of the door began to tremble. Searching the room, he took down a sword that had been proudly displayed on the wall. It was only meant for decoration, but with the right amount of force in one thrust, it could do substantial damage. The clamor had reached the upper level. Even the hail of bullets couldn't stop the raging mob. He listened from inside, covering his ears from the deafening roar of screams, howls, sobbing, and gunfire. He was shaken to his senses as the firm metal of the door was battered. Two sharp, twisting dents deformed its texture. They were coarse, pointed bumps, like the shape of two long horns. He held the sword in front of him, ready to thrust it into the jugulars of the ungrateful horde. Oh, he'd cut off all of their heads, every last one of them. He'd finish them, one by one. And though he'd never trained, he'd seen enough films to mimic the moves of a skilled swordsman. But when the door finally came down, and the bull stormed the safe room with seething menace, he froze. The creature had stripped off its ragged tuxedo and stood atop the broken door. Its muscles were coated in its fetid sweat, and with the blood of nobles that had been torn to shreds with its brutish horns. The mob waited behind, ready to swarm the remaining survivors. "No peace for the wicked," the bull grunted before lowering its horns. When it finally charged, the ravenous crowd swept the Duchess and remaining guests away. The bull darted towards the Duke, who clumsily swung the sword. In sheer, blind luck, he managed to strike its left horn. The strike did it no harm. Rather, it only invigorated its anger. It roared and charged at him once more. Clank! He steadied himself. The floor was slippery with smeared blood. The world around him had become nothing but a big red blur. Body parts flew in all directions. The Duchess's head stood mounted on the mantelpiece. Her eyes had been plucked and eaten. Blood pooled from her mouth after her tongue had been disgorged. The loss of his truest love brought fleeting sorrow to his heart. But no fear was greater than the thought of his own head being displayed beside hers. Bull beat its fist against its bare chest like an ancient tribal drum, as if to summon some unknown force in a ritual of power and strength. The crowd cheered on. The Duke raised the sword, then, closing his eyes and praying for a miracle, he swung. The blade nipped at the beast's thigh,
Yet still, it charged. As he waved the weapon, a long, sharp line appeared across the back of the beast. It cried out in pain before charging again. This time, the tip of the sword had found its way under its chin. It slipped out, coated in blood. The bull stumbled. Its legs folded and collapsed. Reaching a hand out to him, the beast let out a mournful cry of deep, thundering grief. It tried to worm its way back to his feet, hands searching for any kind of support. He gazed down at the dying beast, wondering who hid behind its hideous mask. As he knelt down to remove the mask, something about its eyes struck him as unusual. Unlike the pig and the lamb, it seemed human. It looked up at him with a glint of sadness. Taking in a sharp breath, he pulled the mask off, and then the world beneath him crumbled. There, gasping his last breath, lay the prince, his right hand clutching the fatal wound in his neck. The Duke searched the crowd in disbelief, looking for someone else to blame. Once again, he spotted the bull, the real bull. It fixed its menacing grin on him from the broken doorway. The Duke would rather the crowd had torn him apart. Dear God, how he wished they had. But they only stood around him in eerie silence. They watched him cradle his son in his arms, rocking him back and forth. Part 4. After the prince's death, the Duke locked himself into one of the suites. From the balcony window, he watched as lawlessness ran rampant throughout the island. The first thing he noticed when he poked his head out the window was the smell. The wind carried the stench of burning flesh, like rancid meat roasting over an open fire. Then, looking down, he grew queasy as he surveyed the island grounds, which were now strewn with body parts. Even the swimming pools were reddened with blood. Some, he saw, had the common sense to leave the island. However, their attempt was ill-fated. A large group tried to commandeer the yacht and sail away. The captain and crew were missing, presumably dead, and no one else knew how to operate it. Others tried to escape on smaller boats. The number of passengers simply became too much, and the boats soon overloaded. With turbulent waters and searing winds, the boats overturned and many drowned. Their bodies floated aimlessly in the water. A select few washed ashore, pale blue and entangled in kelp. The chaos soon subsided, yet this would bring no relief. The crimson tide swept the land. More and more collapsed. Their agonized groans shook the sky. With eyes toward the heavens, they begged for a deity to have mercy and end their suffering. The Duke wondered how it had managed to reach the island. After ensuring that every guest and staff member had passed a strict health check, he was sure that Prospero was the only place in the world that the pestilence couldn't touch. Then he saw the lamb. It pranced among the corpses in the gardens, energized and enthralled by the final moans of the dying. The creature twirled around, the long skirt of its tattered white dress flaring up with each graceful motion. Everything it touched died. The flowers withered and the grass blackened. From all directions, the sick and ailing sputtered and defecated blood. Chunks of liquefied organs swam in the ever-widening puddle of human waste. Aghast by what unfolded around him, the Duke was determined to get off the island. He saw his chance when he spotted a boat that had been left at the dock. With grim determination, he took a deep breath, secured a cloth over his nose and mouth, and stepped out. He hurried his way down several flights of stairs, kicking and shoving off every frail and diseased inhabitant that grasped at his sleeves. "Save me!" they cried, with blood oozing from their lips and eyes. Finally, he burst through the front doors and into the warmth of daylight. Although death's stench assaulted his senses, he began to grin. Yes, finally, freedom was within his grasp. Energized and frightened, he hastened toward the docks. And yet, as he zigzagged and leapt over bodies, he came to a sudden stop. The lamb appeared before him. Sunlight died in the two black holes where its eyes were supposed to be. The lamb bleated, "Hell does not thank you. Death does not praise you." Then, stroking the Duke's cheek with a calloused, two-pronged hand, "Those who go down to the pit do not hope." Then it removed its drab mask. The Duke stumbled back in terror as he gazed upon the face underneath. There, before him, was a grinning red skull. Patches of pale skin dangled loosely from its cheek and chin. The Duke picked himself up, shaking breathlessly in abject terror, and stumbled his way to the dock. He bolted away from the apparition. Only occasionally would he glance over his shoulder. To his horror, he saw that the lamb was closing the distance between them. It glided effortlessly over corpses and debris. The Duke climbed into the last remaining boat and cried in relief as the engine whirred to life. Everything would be all right, he thought. As he pulled away from the dock, the lamb dove into the water. With bated breath, he peered over the side, waiting for it to come up and try to climb aboard, dragging him down to his watery end. Slowly, it arose from the ocean. However, it did not make its way onto the boat. Rather, It floated beside him like a piece of drifting kelp for a while. Then it went under again. That was when the black clouds rolled in. Waves swelled to the height of mountains, violently rocking the boat. He felt the boat teeter sideways, close to overturning. But just as he thought he would slip into the roaring, wet darkness and become trapped under a sinking vessel, it would wobble back in upright position. The pig, the bull, and the lamb were teasing him. Lightning streaked across the sky, and for a split second, 3 silhouettes of the pig, the bull, and the lamb dance above the waves. Then thunder roared, one booming cackle after another, as if the 3 creatures were laughing mockingly. The creatures were teasing him and threatening to drown him, only to spare him at the last second when he thought he was going to drown. The Duke held onto the steering wheel for dear life, but he was about to accept his fate when a blurry light seeped through the fog and revived his hope. It was the lighthouse. The waves seemed to push the boat toward the light, though not without teasing him again, rocking the boat and the creatures roaring with laughter. The storm began to calm outside the lighthouse. Now the wind only whistled as it gently knocked on the shuttered windows and door. The Duke crawled out from under the table, with knuckles white from clutching his knife. He cracked open the window ever so slightly, just enough for a quick peek. Instantly, he slammed it shut, his eyebrows scrunched up in mounting panic. His voice quivered. "They're still out there. The pig, the bull, the lamb. All 3 of them. They're just standing outside in this rain." "What do you think they want?" I asked him. The answer was plain for all to see. I wanted to know if he realized it himself. His eyes hardened and jaws clenched. "I won't let them take me. They've stolen everything I had. My island, my family. But they will never have my soul." "Do you think you can escape?" He glared at me, eyeing me with caution, and pointed the knife at me. "You're with them, aren't you?" "I work alone, but occasionally, a few acquaintances and I come together to do..." I paused for a moment to consider my words. "I like to say some house cleaning." "Take off that mask," he demanded, his tone growing ever more hysterical. "What kind of mask is that anyway? It's demonic. Are you even human?" He rambled on. Then, a sudden cough overcame him, forcing him back into the chair as he tried to catch his breath. He coughed into his hand. As he looked down at his palm, his face grew flush with panic. Now, it was only a matter of time until he would succumb to the disease. He wiped his hand on the front of his shirt. Then he rambled incessantly about the location of some bunker. He told me that he knew the man that built it. That was where he was heading. He could not wait another day. He told himself over and over that he'd set off tomorrow, meet up with his friend. I suppose it comforted him to think that he would finally find safety deep underground in this bunker. The cough worsened. Each time he drew in a sharp breath, there was a raspy, gurgling sound. Again, he held up the knife and demanded I remove the mask. "I need to see your face," he said. "All right, if you must." I stepped out of the corner and stood in front of him as he held the tip of the knife to my chest. He was shivering from fear as well as the disease that worked its way into his bones. As I removed the mask, the knife slipped from his fingers, dropping to the floor with a dull thump. He clutched his chest. I have no face of my own. All he could see was his own visage. He grabbed my robe and pulled, but nothing stood underneath. Now I was inside of him, feeling the weakness in his lungs, the fading throb of his heart, and the sickness in his blood. I wormed my way into his ear and whispered, "When your breath departs, you return to the earth. On this day, all your plans perish. I am your death." I was already coursing through his veins, devouring the life from his cells. The Duke screamed in disbelief as his hands and feet began to rot away. In wretched agony, he felt himself slowly wilt like a flower in a drought. The front door began to jolt. After a quick cacophony of battery, it swung open. For a fleeting moment, right before his eyes melted into his skull, he stared in mortification at the shadowy figures of the pig, the bull, and the lamb.